Hi everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Pat Nicholson, and tonight I will be talking about the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived from 1844 to 1900, and whose published works span the years from 1872 to 1889. Now, as some of you may know, in 1889, at the age of 45, Nietzsche suffered a complete mental collapse, and he never recovered from it. So he spent the last 10 years of his life living as an invalid under the care of his sister. Nietzsche, his life was short, and in many ways his personal story is sad. But I'm not going to talk a lot about his biography tonight. Instead, I'm going to focus on his ideas and how they've been interpreted and reinterpreted in the century since his death. But before I get into all of that, I'd like to first acknowledge some of the people that helped me along the way. Starting on your left is Professor Robert Solomon, now deceased. He was one of my professors at the University of Texas, and he introduced me to Nietzsche through his course on existentialism. Next to him is another one of my UT professors, Professor Louis Mackey, who stretched my mind in many directions, but as it concerns Nietzsche, he helped me realize that there were many possible interpretations of his meaning. And I remember this vividly because I visited him during his office hours as a sophomore, and I was very excited because I had figured Nietzsche out, and so I wanted to tell him all about it. So he nodded and smiled and said, well, that's interesting, and let me have you consider a few other things. And many of you will recognize Professor Van Harvey, who's a professor of religious studies here at Stanford and a longtime friend and collaborator of the MLA program. Van reintroduced me to Nietzsche as part of one of his MLA seminars. And through a couple of lectures and many subsequent conversations, Van really lit the spark that led me to this thesis topic. And last but not least is Professor Paul Robinson, who's here with us tonight. He is my thesis advisor, and he's helped me in so many ways, too many ways that I can recount here. But most important, Paul's helped me situate the various Nietzsche interpretations that I've been dealing with within the larger context of the intellectual trends and moods that have changed over time. So I'd like to begin with a quote from Walter Kaufmann. And if any of you have read Nietzsche before, then you've probably read Kaufmann's translations, because the English translations that he provides are the most widely circulated. And Kaufmann writes, Nietzsche's books are easier to read, but harder to understand than almost any other thinker. I think this quote encapsulates my own experience with Nietzsche. On the one hand, his prose is immediately accessible, and if you read any of his books for 30 minutes or more, it will excite your mind to consider and reconsider your philosophical assumptions. On the other hand, the more time you spend on Nietzsche, and if you actually choose to study and write about him, as I have done, you will find that his positions and his ultimate meaning are very difficult to pin down. I think there are two main reasons for this. The first reason is that Nietzsche's philosophical style is unique. Most of his written works are collections of aphorisms that are associated thematically, but they're not organized or presented systematically. Most philosophers lead with a blueprint, carefully establishing each premise such that once you've accepted the foreground of the argument, you're obligated to accept the conclusions. Nietzsche doesn't operate like that, and he doesn't really set up his arguments at all. So the careful reader has to go back into the passages in which he leads with bold conclusions and find other associated passages and try to extract and reconstruct the arguments that support those conclusions. And another reason that Nietzsche is hard to pin down is that he often takes up both sides of a position. So he's famous for contradicting himself. And in one passage, he'll argue emphatically for something only to undermine that position or argue in favor of something else later in the same work. For the reasons I've just mentioned, Nietzsche is one of the most variously interpreted thinkers of our recent intellectual history. There's a vast secondary literature devoted to his philosophy, and he's widely cited in support of a host of different ideological and theoretical positions. Now, this kind of quasi-word cloud that I put together covers just some of them, and you'll notice that there's a lot of diametrically opposed positions here. I mean, how many people are associated with deconstruction and postmodernism and theology? Not many. And how many people can, lay claim to the fame of being appropriated by both the Nazis and feminists? Well, Nietzsche can. And I'm not going to cover all this ground. I don't cover it in my thesis, and I can't cover all this tonight. My thesis focuses on just two of the positions, free will and determinism. Together they form what I view as the central paradox of Nietzsche's philosophy, because at various times Nietzsche affirms and denies the possibility of free will. Of course, the free will versus determinism debate is nothing new. It's as old as philosophy itself. But the fact that Nietzsche seems to champion both sides of the debate has yielded radically opposed interpretations of his philosophy that fall into two camps. The first camp offers what I call a gentle reading. which affirms human freedom and promotes the idea that we can create our values and at least partially shape our life outcomes through the process of deliberation and choice. In 1950, Walter Kaufmann, who we referenced a few slides back, provided the seminal gentle reading of Nietzsche, at least in North America. And for the next 50 years, the themes of freedom and self-creation have been at the forefront of Nietzsche scholarship in America. I refer to the second camp of interpretations as hard readings. On this view, we may feel and believe that we are consciously choosing our values and actions, but in reality, our attitudes and choices are all predetermined by neurophysical factors over which we have no control, and we often have no visibility. This harder strain of interpretation that portrays Nietzsche as a naturalist emerged in the mid-1990s, and it now dominates Nietzsche scholarship in America. And it aligns to the larger contemporary trend of reductive naturalism that is championed by theorists like Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins. So those may be some names that you're familiar with. My thesis explores how and to what degree we should consider Nietzsche a naturalist by examining two of the leading voices in this new trend. The pivotal figure in this movement is Brian Leiter, who is currently a professor of both law and philosophy at the University of Chicago. Within the arena of philosophy, Leiter has made it his mission to correct the view that Nietzsche should be regarded as the prophet of self-creation. He wants to set the record straight and say that Nietzsche was a thorough and unwavering naturalist who denies the possibility of human freedom at every turn. And it's appropriate that he is both a law and philosophy professor, for I find his philosophical style litigious. This is most apparent in the way that he attempts to dismiss or disqualify evidence in Nietzsche's writings that don't fit his interpretation. The other representative of this trend is John Richardson, a professor of philosophy at NYU. Like Leiter, Richardson also wants to honor Nietzsche's aspiration to naturalize his philosophy and his conception of human nature. But unlike Leiter, Richardson concedes that Nietzsche is inconsistent and reveals several ways in which Nietzsche's ideas are not natural at all. And we're going to look at some of those. It's clear that Richardson is far less concerned with having the final word on Nietzsche. Instead, he is concerned with how we might reconcile Nietzsche's thinking on naturalism and human agency, and how this might serve as a good model for us to think on these thorny issues. Before we contrast the differences between Leiter and Richardson's interpretations, I first want to cover some of the key philosophical terms and assumptions that they both consider common ground. Please brace yourselves, as the topic involves a lot of philosophical jargon. And I've tried to break things down into just plain language and to use some pictures and diagrams just to spell out the concepts, because the jargon kind of obscures the meaning, and the meaning really isn't that hard to grasp if it's presented in the right way. So let's see how I do. Let's begin with the term naturalism. Now, if you're like me, when you hear the word naturalism, it evokes positive connotations, and maybe beautiful images of nature come to mind, like this waterfall we have here. But that's not what we're concerned with here tonight. Tonight, what we're referring to is better understood as philosophical naturalism, which refers to a core set of assumptions and assertions about the world we live in. Broadly speaking, philosophical naturalism is the view that everything in the universe is subject to the laws of nature and that nothing exists beyond the natural universe. On this view, everything in the universe reduces to physical matter within space and time. And there are rules that govern and explain the structure and behavior of all physical matter, which we call natural laws. Philosophical naturalists believe that everything can be explained through physical causation. There may be some things we lack the ability to explain today, but the belief is that eventually everything can be understood and explained through physical causes. This worldview denies the existence and the efficacy of anything above nature or beyond nature. So it doesn't allow for any metaphysical or supernatural explanations. Instead, there are only natural explanations, which all conform to a simple but powerful logic. For any event P that occurs at time t, P is necessary due to the totality of facts that precede time t. Now, as promised in plain language, this means that every event is the result of preceding causes. And therefore, every event is necessary based on the long chain of events that lead up to it. On this view, nothing happens by chance. And so, I see this as a fatalistic worldview that has kind of been reclothed in kind of scientific terminology. And that's what we're talking about here. So this simple and seemingly innocuous logic, which is the central proposition of naturalism, carries enormous theoretical implications. Now, Nietzsche was most interested in how the shift from a theistic worldview to a scientific worldview would change the way we think of human nature and human psychology. To put this in perspective, we can consider the special place that humanity occupies in the Christian tradition. This is an image of the great chain of being, and we sit here, right in the middle, where we are both of the earth and of heaven. Like the animals in the hierarchy below us, we are made of flesh and blood, and we're subject to the laws of natural necessity. But like the heavenly beings above us, we possess a soul, an intellect, free will, and these divine endowments are not subject to the laws of natural necessity. And it is through these divine endowments that we transcend the limitations of our bodies and of causality. It is by positing a dual nature like this that philosophers have long justified the logic that humans are more than mere animals, that we are of a different origin, and that we possess the ability to transcend the limitations of our finite bodily existence. This is what we mean when we talk about free will in the metaphysical sense. Now, I'm not saying this is contemporary thinking, but this is long-standing thinking about free will. So Nietzsche, in this passage from Beyond Good and Evil, articulates the task of replacing this traditional metaphysical view of human nature with a natural conception. Nietzsche writes, "To translate man back into nature, to become master over the many vain and overly enthusiastic interpretations and connotations that have so far been scrawled and painted over the eternal basis text of Homo Natura, to see to it that man henceforth stands before man as even today, hardened in the discipline of science he stands, deaf to the siren songs of old metaphysical bird catchers who have been piping at him all too long. You are more, you are high, you are of a different origin." That may be a strange and insane task, but it is a task. Who would deny this? Nietzsche was vehemently opposed to the notion that humans are somehow more than, higher than, or of a different origin from other animals. And this passage serves as an important middle ground for Leiter and Richardson, who both view the task of translating man back into nature as Nietzsche's philosophical mission. Now we can focus on what differentiates Leiter. Yeah, that is Leiter here. What differentiates Leiter and Richardson's reading of Nietzsche, because up to now everything's been common ground. We'll focus on Leiter and evaluate his interpretation of Nietzsche's psychology and the terrible truth he believes it reveals about human nature. Leiter starts with the premise that humans are merely another form of animal life, composed of physical matter, wholly contained within space and time, and subject to the laws of nature. This scientific worldview is far less alarming to us today than it was to people in the 19th century, but we've had more time to get used to it. And theistic beliefs hold far less sway in our culture today than they did then. And many people now readily accept a worldview without heaven and hell, for instance. But even though most people look at the world through a more naturalistic lens, most of us still regard humans as occupying a special place in the natural order, as the highest form of life. And our distinguishing feature is consciousness, which is the hub and source of the many things that make us human. Things like extended memory, our capacity for language and reason, our notion of a self, and most important, it is the control center from which we exercise agency and free will. And, therefore, these things are expressed, and our free will is expressed through our speech, thoughts, and actions. As a result of our consciousness and its many attendant abilities, most of us believe in the notion of mind over matter. That consciousness gives us the capacity to recognize the various impulses and appetites from our bodily existence and consciously deliberate our course of action. We don't have complete control over what urges arise in our being, and in many cases we follow our appetites. But most of us believe we have the power to determine our thoughts and speech, and most of us believe in our ability to resist our appetites and act in accordance with our reason. This proposition seems self-evident, and it seems kind of strange that we'd spend this much time on it, but it's being challenged. This common conception is the basis of our notion of responsibility that's ubiquitous in law, religion, and our common understanding. Leiter puts this common understanding on trial, and he calls on passages like this one from the Twilight of Idols as evidence. Nietzsche writes, "In the inner world is full of phantoms. The will is one of them. The will no longer moves anything, hence does not explain anything either. It merely accompanies events. The so-called motive, another error, merely a surface phenomenon of consciousness, something alongside the deed. What follows from this? There are no mental causes at all." The view that motivations and mental states are just a surface phenomenon, something alongside the deed, but not central to the action, is a philosophical position known as epiphenomenalism. And to illustrate this concept, you can think of the sound that a car makes while you're driving it. So you hear this sound, it accompanies the action of driving forward, but the sound doesn't play a causal role in making the car drive or propelling it forward. It just accompanies the action. And so what Nietzsche suggests, and what Leiter argues, is that all mental states are just like this. So essentially, our acts of thinking, willing, making choices, all these things are just epiphenomenal events that accompany the core action of what's happening in the body. Leiter reminds us that the basic units of agency in Nietzsche's psychology are the drives, which are located in the body and not in the mind. The drives are the source and the causal determinants of both our actions, which are primary, and our mental states, which are secondary. As this diagram depicts, when a drive expresses itself, it produces both a physical action. I need to get to the slide. Oops, I'm sorry, I went a little too far. There we go. So here are our drives. These are the determinants of action. And when a drive wants to express itself, it expresses itself in the physical world, out of our bodies, out into the world. And at the same time, it fires off this mental state, which we think of as being primary, but what's being argued here is that it's secondary, and it's really just something that accompanies the deed. So this is kind of a mind-bending concept, and according to Nietzsche, as human beings, we are not the sum of our mental states. Instead, we're a bundle of physical drives to and for various goals, such as the drives for nourishment and the drive to procreate. These drives are more than just mere urges, for they are dispositions that are persistent and that recur again and again. The ultimate drive, and the drive that best explains the behavior of all the other drives in Nietzsche's concept of human psychology, is the will to power. Drives are all expressions of this will to power, and they fight with one another to grow, spread, seize, and dominate. The picture that emerges from Nietzsche's psychology is a Hobbesian war of all against all, but it's not out there in the world amongst individuals fighting with one another. It's happening on the inner stage of the individual. And on this stage, the balance of power is constantly in flux, with different drives elbowing their way to the front of the line. Now, when I consider Leiter's arguments and the notion that consciousness is epiphenomenal, I have a strong visceral reaction. I immediately want to refute this. And, I think of all the ways in which I form intentions, make choices, muster my willpower, and strive towards, goals that I've set for myself in life. And we all do this. I mean, that's just a natural way to think. And I like to think that it's not just coming from my drives, as Leiter would have it. At some point in our lives, we've all resolved ourselves to address a problem or try to improve ourselves in some way. Many of us have pursued a self-selected program to focus our thinking and behavior. Some of you may have trained for a marathon before. Others of you may have had a problem at some point in your life and you needed help from a third party and you sought that. And many of us in the room have decided to write a thesis, right? So, these are all actions and examples where we set goals for ourselves, we marshal our willpower, and we strive towards a goal. Now, Leiter entertains a lot of examples like this in his writings, but he ultimately dismisses all of them and the notion of personal responsibility altogether. He cites passages like this one from Daybreak, where Nietzsche suggests that our conscious experience of things like deliberation, intention, and struggle are merely secondary effects that accompany the underlying struggle of the drives. Nietzsche writes, that one wants to combat the vehemence of a drive at all does not stand within our power, nor does the choice of any particular method, nor does the success or failure of this method. What is clearly the case is that in this entire procedure, our intellect is only the blind instrument of another drive. While we believe we are complaining about the vehemence of a drive, at bottom it is just one drive which is complaining about another. This cuts against our deepest intuitions. We believe that we are driving, that we are in control, and that our intellect can steer our behavior left or right in life. Instead, what Nietzsche suggests and Leiter argues is that our drives compete for the steering wheel, and that our intellect is steered left and right depending on which drives gain control. Leiter is willing to concede a few things. For example, he will concede that in certain rare individuals, the complex of drives synthesize into a coherent structure in which the lesser drives fall under the command of a few dominant drives. So you notice one drive is bigger than the others and everything is lining up to it. This is essentially like a rough drawing of what a unified drive structure might look like. And someone that possessed this would be more capable in life. Now, depending on what that dominant drive is, they might be an artistic genius, or they might be a dangerous sociopath. But while Leiter will concede this, that a unified drive structure is is something that can happen, he'll never consider it an achievement that is brought about through conscious intention or willing. In his words, such people are just a natural artifact. Leiter is also willing to concede that mental states can play a role in a causal chain leading to action. But he holds that mental states are always once removed from the drives, and that nothing actually originates in consciousness, so it can't be the ultimate cause of anything. So no matter what example you come up with Leiter, he's going to devise an argument, and it's going to basically be the same thing. He's going to resort to this regressive logic of natural causality to get back to the drives and undermine the importance of consciousness and the possibility of freedom. And that's why I liken reading Leiter to a big game of philosophical whack-a-mole. I've spent a lot of time with this guy over the last year and a half, and I've argued with him a lot in my head, and when I find his, this is the way I think of it. So to recap Leiter, on his reading, Nietzsche reveals the terrible truth. And the terrible truth is that there is no free will, there's only causal necessity, and therefore there is no responsibility, and no right or wrong, no normative judgments of any sort. And in the end, there are only facts. This happened and that happened, and everything happens out of necessity. The terrible truth is that to be human is to be the arena in which this quarrelsome interplay of the drives plays out. Natural forces are always at work, but the narratives we construct on top of them are epiphenomenal, and they don't have any causal force in our lives. Thus, our experience of choice and deliberation, of steering a course in life, is at best a sideshow that follows the main action, which moves forward independent of our thoughts. I'll let you digest that for a second. And at this point, I imagine you've had enough of Leiter. And we're going to move on to our next philosopher, John Richardson. And he offers alternatives to Leiter's conclusions that can still be considered natural, hence the title of this section, Natural Alternatives. In particular, we will focus on two ways in which Richardson challenges Leiter. First, by claiming that the drives are not natural forces at all, and second, by offering a different account of the origins and the efficacy of consciousness. Richardson evaluates Nietzsche's aspiration to naturalize his philosophy and his conception of humanity through the lens of Darwin. Richardson believes that Nietzsche learned important lessons from Darwin, and that the theory of natural selection holds the key for Nietzsche to truly realize his goal of translating man back into nature. He acknowledges up front that Nietzsche doesn't always apply these lessons. Many aspects of his philosophy and psychology rely on metaphysical conceptions that are not consistent or compatible with naturalism. In my thesis, I devote significant attention to the many issues that hinder our ability to see Nietzsche as a naturalist. But in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on just one example that complicates Leiter's picture of human psychology. In many places, such as this passage from The Will to Power, Nietzsche promotes the idea that our drives possess minds of their own. It is our needs that interpret the world, our drives for and against. Every drive is a lust to rule. Each one has its perspective that it would like to compel all the other drives to accept as a norm. Nietzsche often portrays the drives in this way, as intelligent entities that exercise cognitive functions. And he tells us that the drives do things like adopt perspectives and generate evaluations. Now, this is one of the stranger aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy. And when he does this, he is merely moving the model of agency that we associate with our conscious mind down into the body. And by doing so, he's assigning many minds to each body. So there are a lot of labels we can apply to this conception, in addition to wacky. Terms like mentalism, vitalism, and metaphysics all apply. And none of those terms is compatible with philosophical naturalism, at least not a naturalism that a modern-day naturalist would ever adopt. I believe Richardson deserves a lot of credit for confronting evidence that works against his interpretation. I think it speaks of intellectual honesty in his style. And he reminds us that Nietzsche was trained as a metaphysician and not as a biologist. And he often falls back on these metaphysical explanations of the things that he's trying to explain. But in the case of the drives, Richardson contends that Nietzsche is most concerned with explaining how goals and motivations can exist in advance of events happening. The most common way we think of goal-oriented behavior is as a product of a person who forms an intention, who musters their willpower and strives to reach a goal. And this seems to be exactly the sort of mental model that Nietzsche is applying to the drives here. Richardson argues that Darwin provides a natural alternative for explaining the way that our current dispositions and actions are the result of predetermined goals. In Darwin's account, our physical features, our dispositions and behaviors, and all of the things about us all result from a deep historical process. Natural selection. Natural selection involves the interplay between organisms and their environment. And organisms with traits that are well suited to their environment have a reproductive advantage. That is, they tend to survive longer and they have more opportunities to reproduce, and therefore their traits persist throughout the species over time at a higher rate. And from here it's just a matter of mathematics. Given a stable environment with sizable populations, even traits that provide a slight reproductive advantage will multiply and become dominant over many generations. And this chart articulates the process. You can see, just imagine this circle as a species. Mutation occurs that produces variation in the traits of the species. The traits that are favorable to the environment survive at a higher rate and live to reproduce. And over time, through the power of compound interest, those traits become dominant in the population. Find my place here. So we can think of the results of natural selection as a goal that exists in advance of future results. And I think this is what Nietzsche was trying to get at, but he lacked the language and carried too much metaphysical baggage to articulate it in this way. So when we talk about natural selection today, we think of it more as an algorithmic interplay between organisms and their environment. And we don't need to talk about minds or intentions at all in order to explain how things evolved the way they did. And so this provides kind of a natural teleology that we have to just give Nietzsche a little bit of a pass on, because there weren't many people offering natural teleology at the day. Darwin was. I think Nietzsche recognized this at times, and at times he applied this to his thinking on the drives. And I have a few examples here to share. So here are two quotes that support this point. In Philosophy and Truth, Nietzsche writes, "The horrible consequences of Darwinism, which by the way I hold to be true, are that instincts are already the product of an endlessly long continued process." And again, later he writes, "The purpose of the drives is achieved but not willed. The kinds of pleasurable movements which serve the purpose of preservation are preserved through selection." So it's clear that Nietzsche comprehends natural selection, and at times he applies it to his thinking on the drives. Richardson acknowledges that Nietzsche doesn't always treat the drives in this way, but he says that when Nietzsche does treat the drives as a product of selection, that his philosophy profits from it. Now, he acknowledges that Nietzsche's dominant view is the mentalist conception we just looked at a few slides back. But in several instances, he does treat the drives as a product of selection. And when he does that, he's doing something that aligns to our contemporary thinking in genetics. We have to remember that both Darwin and Nietzsche were developing their theories before the advent of modern genetics. Darwin had his concept of the gemmules, and Nietzsche has his concept of the drives. And in both cases, and particularly in the case of the drives, the drives are much more speculative and far less scientifically rigorous than what we know about genes today. But the drives are analogous to genes, which after all are physical matter that contain instruction sets that determine our neurophysical constitution, and therefore they determine our traits and dispositions in advance of them happening in time and space. Right? So it's kind of a goal that exists in advance of things actually being materialized and actualized in the world. So we're going to move, with the time that we have remaining, onto one more way that Richardson challenges Leiter's picture of Nietzsche's psychology. Here we have our familiar diagram with the drives and consciousness. Richardson agrees with Leiter's claim that the drives are the principal explainers in Nietzsche's psychology. But he counters that they are not the sole explainer of human behavior. He believes there is a second causal force that determines who we are and what we become. To support this claim, he looks at passages like this one from The Gay Science, in which Nietzsche offers a theory on the origins of consciousness. Nietzsche writes, "The development of language and the development of consciousness go hand in hand, because both have the function to facilitate communication. Consciousness is really just a binding net between person and person. Only in this capacity did it have to develop. It doesn't belong to the individual existence of a person, but rather to the community, to the herd nature in him." Now here Nietzsche suggests that consciousness and our cognitive abilities do not arise out of our genetic makeup. Instead, consciousness is a product of the social matrix of individual humans living in community. This is a profound insight that changes the picture of Nietzsche's psychology and makes it much more interesting. So, in this revised schema, we are determined by bodily instincts, which develop through the process of natural selection, but we're also determined by a second form of instincts that we'll call social instincts, which originate from society and have evolved through a process of social selection. In this picture, our cognitive abilities like memory, language, and reason are not simply tools that serve the interests of the drives. Instead, they are a powerful counterforce that expresses the interests of the herd against the interests of the individual. And the interests of the herd are codified in language and through norms and values that get embedded in us through our educational system. As humans living in society, we gain many benefits in exchange for upholding the communal values and just for being normal. So in Richardson's diagram of the human psyche, there are two seats of agency, one that is based in our genetic makeup and the other that is located in our consciousness. Richardson correlates this revised picture with Nietzsche's ideas on the origins of morality, in which Nietzsche theorizes two stages of moral development, which I'll cover briefly. Nietzsche refers to the earliest stage of moral development as the ethics of custom, and he imagines a time when humanity was much closer to our animal existence and hadn't yet formed sophisticated language or memory. In these primitive societies, the selfish and aggressive drives of the individuals needed to be restrained for the well-being of the larger group. And these societies used taboos and totems to remind people of the horrible punishments they would suffer if they broke the rules. As the theory goes, when people would witness things like public torture or banishment, they would associate it with these symbols, and it would aid them in remembering to avoid those behaviors. So this is kind of a speculative anthropology that Nietzsche engages in. And he offers a grim but plausible hypothesis that the early formation of language and extended memory was a byproduct of punishment and this symbology of threats. On this telling, the emotion that was most strongly associated with the formation of consciousness is fear. The ethics of custom describes the development of consciousness and morality during the long prehistory of humanity. The second phase of moral development concerns the more recent and relatively short history of human civilization. In this second phase, human consciousness has evolved in step with civilization, and our system of symbols, rules, and punishments has not only become far more sophisticated, but it has also become internalized within consciousness. Nietzsche refers to this process of internalizing societal norms as sublimation. In the more recent phase, the individual's more aggressive drives are enlisted as enforcers of social norms. Societal norms, which are embedded in language and reinforced by moral education, compete with the drives to control and tame the individuals within society and make them good herd animals, to use Nietzsche's terminology. Now, when we violate social norms, we become society's first line of defense. And the way we punish ourselves is through guilt. So this is kind of a shorthand explanation, and it'd be kind of interesting to do a whole piece on this. But it's a shorthand explanation of the theory of sublimation that is most often associated with Freud. But, we have to give Nietzsche credit because he was the first thinker to articulate this and to use it in a psychological context. And he did this 30 to 40 years before Freud did. So Nietzsche was prophetic in many ways. So in the revised psychology, which I think gets a lot more interesting, consciousness is a form of agency, and our experiences of deliberation, choice, and acting intentionally do have causal force. The force of these mental states does not arise out of our genetic makeup, but it comes from society. This has profound implications to how we think about human nature and freedom. If you accept this view, you can look at it, and while it doesn't amount to freedom in the metaphysical sense that we reviewed at the beginning of this presentation, that would require that it transcends space, time, and causality. But it is a freedom of sorts in that it allows us to transcend and override the impulses of our drives. It acts as a counterforce to that. And the great irony of this view is that what we regard as the self is not rooted in our individual existence. Instead, the self is rooted in society. And what we claim as freedom is really just the ability to put a lid on our impulses and to tame and channel our vital energy in socially acceptable ways. In my view, this is a far more descriptive and interesting conception of human psychology than Leiter's account of epiphenomenalism. Now I will offer my concluding thoughts on Leiter and Richardson and my own view on Nietzsche, at least as it concerns these topics. My thesis explores how and to what degree Nietzsche should be considered a naturalist, and it also analyzes the arguments for and against the notion that consciousness is epiphenomenal. Out of necessity, I could only cover a few examples of the philosophical issues and puzzles that I deal with in my thesis. My goal was to cut through some of the jargon and make the core issues and claims clear, and to show you what's at stake in these debates. This isn't just a 19th century debate, about Nietzsche. Leiter represents the worldview of many contemporary naturalists who claim that consciousness is an ineffective byproduct of evolution, and therefore it serves no purpose. So that's a pretty chilling thought. It's always disturbed me, and it's part of what had me galvanize my efforts to argue against it. You can find passages in Nietzsche that predict and support this hypothesis, but you can also find other passages, some that we examine, that present a more complex and more interesting notion of the origins and the role of consciousness. Of the two interpreters I examine, it's pretty obvious that I favor Richardson, but both Leiter and Richardson have merits. Let's take Leiter first. On the positive side, Leiter offers ample evidence that Nietzsche takes a hard line against freedom and the importance of consciousness. At minimum, this evidence complicates and undermines the portrayal of Nietzsche that has dominated Nietzsche scholarship for more than 50 years. It throws a wrench into the proclamations that Nietzsche was the first existentialist, or that he was the first postmodern. And it definitely throws a wrench into the idea that he's this sort of prophet of self-creation. So in the context of Nietzsche studies, Leiter deserves credit and serves as a legitimate corrective function on the scholarship that preceded him. But Leiter is ultimately too reductive for my taste, both in his interpretation of Nietzsche and in his own philosophical views. He's too smug and he's too satisfied with simply reciting the interminable logic of causal necessity. He's entitled to this view, but he isn't entitled to present Nietzsche as an unwavering naturalist. Just as Nietzsche sometimes argues for causal necessity, at other times he argues for the possibility of freedom, and he offers metaphysical explanations like we examine. We didn't have time to address Leiter's attempts to strike contrary evidence from the record, but had we done it, you would see that rhetorically, Leiter is brilliant. And like a good trial lawyer, he plays to win. But ultimately, all of his machinations and manipulations of the text really cast doubt on his interpretation and his real motives. In my view, his real motive is to appropriate Nietzsche in order to establish his voice amongst the other contemporary reductive naturalists like Dennett, Dawkins, and Harris. So let's offer a final word on Richardson. Richardson, in my view, provides a brilliant synthesis of select ideas from Nietzsche's corpus. His interpretation threads the needle in a way that resolves key conflicts and presents an interesting and thought-provoking picture in its own right. On the other side of the coin, we have to acknowledge that this interpretation is synthetic. We cannot conclusively say that this was Nietzsche's ultimate viewpoint or his intent. Richardson, to his credit, acknowledges this up front, and he proposes that many of Nietzsche's ideas are simply strange, and we reviewed just a few of them, like the notion that the drives possess minds. And in many other cases, his concepts are still laden with metaphysical language and baggage that undermine his aspiration to naturalize his philosophy. But in some cases, Nietzsche starts down pathways that could fulfill his natural aspirations. And in the process, Nietzsche sheds light on the evolution of consciousness and the development of human moral psychology. I prefer Richardson's approach because I think it brings the best that Nietzsche has to offer to the forefront. And furthermore, I believe that Richardson's approach is the best approach available to Nietzsche scholars, because Nietzsche is so conflicted and inconsistent that I don't think a singular final interpretation of Nietzsche is possible. Despite his many inconsistencies, however, Nietzsche had amazing insights and a prophetic vision for the key philosophical issues and problems that we're still dealing with today. And we don't have conclusive answers to these issues. So this isn't just a 19th century debate. All of these issues are still at the forefront of our current intellectual milieu, if I say that right. Of the various notions that Nietzsche suggests, I agree that we have far less control over our lives and over our own psyches than is commonly supposed. Much of who we are and what we become is determined by forces outside of our control, such as our genetic makeup and our cultural environment. So I reject the idea of free will in the metaphysical sense, and I don't think many people hold on to that notion explicitly, at least not many intellectuals that think about it, right? But there's a lot of that that's still embedded in just our common understanding, right? So I think Nietzsche exposes a lot of that. That said, I also reject the notion of epiphenomenalism emphatically. Instead, I gravitate to the ideas within Nietzsche that allow for a modest form of free will. in which our conscious mental states can play a limited but meaningful role in shaping our material condition in the world, and can play a huge role in shaping our mental condition and our overall life experience. So I want to thank you again for your time and attention, and I hope that you walk away from this tonight with some good food for thought. Thank you.